Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're again in Ezekiel, as we will be for a while, and today we're going to study chapters 6 and 7. So let's get right to it. Last week, we studied chapters 4 and 5, and they both had dramatic, and when I say dramatic, I mean the acting out drama, the acting out of some of the prophecies. They had both dramatic and vocal elements. So you had the acting out of some prophecies and you had some spoken words that go along with it. Chapter 6, these chapters started with the sins of the nations and moved on to specifically rebellion against God's laws and decrees. In fact, let me read chapter 5, verse 6 as a sort of a review. It says, "Yet in her wickedness she had rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and not followed my decrees." So she was worse than the nations that surrounded Israel in that she rejected God's laws and decrees. But she's worse in that the nations didn't even have that. They didn't have the laws and decrees to reject or to accept, for that matter. But so God is not happy with his people. So they moved on to specifically rebellion against God's laws and decrees, and then on to the detestable idols, which we're going to see as we go forward in our study. Chapter 6 moves on to the mountains and high places and detestable practices which are associated with pagan worship. Really and truthfully, for me, chapter 6 and 7 are warnings for what's coming in chapter 8. It's a very serious matter from here on out in Ezekiel. The drama of chapter 6 has 4 divisions. Verses 1 and 2 deal with Ezekiel's that is commanded to preach to the mountains of Israel. Verses 3 through 7 is a warning for destruction of places of idolatry, which is the high places, which we'll be looking at and talking about some. Verses 8 through 10 are a brief interlude of hope. A repentant remnant, the hope is that there is a repentant remnant which will be saved and preserved in exile. Remember I told you the remnant was thought to be the people that stayed in Jerusalem, but they're the ones that are going to be slaughtered. The actual remnant are the ones that were taken into captivity and exile into Babylon. Then the fourth part of that chapter is verses 11 through 14, which is a mocking lament of the devastation Israel's idolatry has caused. All right, so let's get on into chapter 6. Let me read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6 of Ezekiel. "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against the mountains of Israel, prophesy against them, and say, you mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys. I am about to bring about a sword against you, and I will destroy your high places." I think I read too far. I think I included verse 3. So verse 1 and 2 is the actual word that came to Ezekiel and what God said in relation to the prophecy that he's to give the people as regarding the mountains of Israel. We'll talk about what that actually means. This prophecy has both a symbolic action and a spoken message. He says, set your face. Back on 5:3, we had the iron skillet. Ezekiel was instructed to draw on a piece of clay the city of Jerusalem, and then he would play the part of God, and between himself and that clay rendering of Jerusalem was a skillet. And that was designed to be symbolic of the separation of God, or of Jerusalem from God. So he says, set your face against the iron skillet was set between the city and the opposing. It was like the opposing troops. Then set your face as an approaching. Set your face against them as an approaching attacking general would do. It is a negative thing for Israel. Here against it is a negative thing to set your face, then prophesy against. He says both things. Set your face against the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them as well. So you got two negative things working on Israel for the prophecy that's coming from God. The mountains of Israel, the term mountains of Israel occurs 16 times in Ezekiel's. And every time we should probably learn what he is referring to. It is though the mountains are an audience to hear God's message. It's like he's talking to the mountains. The truth of the matter is that the mountains are always, the physical mountains, as with any element of creation, are always obedience to God's will for them. It is what they refer to, what they actually refer to, or what they're symbolic of, is what our concern is in this prophecy. Sometimes they refer to the whole land of Israel. We'll see that sometimes they receive condemnation. Other times they will receive blessings that apply to the whole land of Israel. But here, this is serious. Now listen to this. Here, the mountains were centers of idolatrous worship. They will represent Israel's apostasy and perversion of the good and holy things of God. We're going to talk about their spiritual infidelity and their apostasy. They've turned to idolatry, and we'll talk a little bit more of that as we get into this and we go through our study. But they've turned to idolatry, and that's what these mountains are going to be concerned with, what the land of Israel has become. They had shrines built in groves on the hillsides and mountains dedicated to Canaanite deities. So you've got the temple, and you've got the high places. You read through all of the Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, Daniel. Anytime you're talking about the high places, you're talking about high places up in the hills which were dedicated to worship of idols. Yeah. They tried to mix elements of Canaanite worship with Yahweh worship, which is really, really interesting. If you've ever studied Hosea, Hosea was actually came before Ezekiel because it was referring to prophecies to the northern kingdom, where Ezekiel is referring to prophecies concerning the southern kingdom. And the apostasy of the northern kingdom was really hoped to be a warning to the southern kingdom to change their ways, which they didn't. We actually see that the southern kingdom actually became worse than the northern kingdom, which was conquered by Assyria in 722. And here we're 722 BC, and here we're talking round numbers 600 BC. So the end result here is the spoken word of judgment. That's what comes in verse 2. All right, let me read verses 3 through 7, chapter 6. And say, the mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys. I'm about to bring a sword against you, and I will destroy your high places. Your altars, in verse 4 is your altars will be demolished, and your incense altars will be smashed, and I will slay your people in front of your idols. I will lay the dead bodies of the Israelites in front of their idols, and I will scatter your bones around your altars. Verse 6, wherever you live, the towns will be laid waste and the high places demolished, so that your altars will be laid waste and devastated, your idols smashed and ruined, your incense altars broken down, and what you have made wiped out. In verse 7, your people will fall slain among you, and you will know that I am the Lord. Wow. It's a quick note. Before the temple was built, worship in the high places was not considered particularly offensive because they had no other place to worship. They didn't have a temple. They didn't have the tabernacle, well, however. When the temple was built, worship in other places was supposedly prohibited. So once we had the temple that was built by Solomon, then the law was, this is the place to worship. This is where you should be going for worship. So Solomon's first claim to fame was that he was the one that built the temple. His second claim to fame was that he was the king that got all of this apostasy started. He married many pagan women, and when he brought them to his throne, the place where he led Israel from, he allowed them to bring their idols with them. Where he should have said, as you're marrying me, you're getting rid of that stuff, he allowed them to keep it and even bring it into Jerusalem. High places, when we talk about the high places, we're talking about 4 parts, and they're mentioned here. There's an altar for sacrifices made of wood and stone. There are wooden poles to represent the female goddess of fertility. Asherah, at least one stone pillar to represent the male deity Baal. There were smaller incense altars for use in eating a sacrificial meal and practicing sacred prostitution. Yes, that is exactly what you're thinking it is, and it was performed in the name of worship. And I want to go back up just a minute when I talked about the stone pillars, one to represent female goddess of fertility and one to represent the male deity Baal. I want to just back up a minute just to tell you, I really like comparing, whenever it's appropriate, to compare what happened in the northern kingdom when the Assyrians, what was going on there when the Assyrians conquered them. Compare that to what's going on in Jerusalem when Babylon conquered them. So we've got this mixture in Jerusalem of mixing worship with Baal and Yahweh all together. In Hosea's day, in the time of the northern kingdom, they even built 2 temples, and they had 2 golden calves. The golden calf was actually to represent Baal, but the interesting thing was they mixed their worship practices of Baal and Yahweh together, and they were so fouled up in their understanding and what they had come to be, they thought that Baal and Yahweh were 2 different names for the same God. They were so far out of the loop with what God was wanting. That's where they were, and that should point to a pretty firm understanding of why God was so upset. He's dealing with worse than that when he's talking about what's going on in the southern kingdom in Judah and Jerusalem with all this going on. The building of idols to combine Judaism with Canaanite worship was to be wiped out. That was what the end result of all this apostasy is going to be for them, not because of the detestable nature of the gods to Yahweh, because there's always going to be a conflict between God and pagan God, Yahweh and pagan gods. Always. It's always going to be there. That was not the problem. The problem was that the people chose Baal over God, over Yahweh. That was the problem. They had forsaken God, and he was going to deal with it. Eventually, he deals with it, and the eventuality is a certainty, and it's an imminency right now of judgment, and serious judgment, which we're going to see today. Okay. The judgment that's coming is against God's people. So let's look at verse 6 and 7 verse 6. Let me read verse. Well, I've already read it, but let me just tell you in verse 6, we talked about wherever you live. We mentioned it here. Wherever you live, the towns will be laid waste, and so on and so forth. The wherever you live includes these things. It includes the towns, cities where you live, the high places where you worship, your worship idols, your altars to idols, the idols, and incense altars. All of that rolled into one is what God is talking about when he says, wherever you live, I'm going to destroy. Those are the things he's talking about. In verse 7, the result is that the people will be killed, and you will know it is God who is judging, and he does not accept these idols, and he will not share his people with them. He says, in verse 7, he said, you people will fall slain among you, and you will know that I am the Lord. When he says that, you will know that I am the Lord, what that is pointing to is the fact that its judgment is going to be done in such a way as them to know that it is God that did it. Babylon is going to be his rod of discipline, the rod he's going to use to discipline Israel. God is going to use a pagan nation, Babylon, to discipline his people. When it's all said and done, they're going to know that even though Babylon was the one that physically performed it, it is God that caused it and directed it. That's what that's going to mean. We're going to hear that. You will know that I'm the Lord. You're going to hear that all through Ezekiel, and that's what it's talking about. Whatever it's talking about means that you're going to know it's going to be done in such a way that you know that it was God that did it. All right. And it says the terms here are very graphic. Usually bones would be found around places of sacrifice. Right? You sacrifice an animal, what's the burnt offering, what's left is the bones. Well, here in front of these pagan idols, his people are going to be killed. God's people are going to be killed, and their bones are going to be scattered in front of the pagan idols. They're not places of sacrifice of animals. They're places where his people are going to be killed at their worship places. Throughout this passage, the emphasis moves from the mountains to the worship centers, then to the people who are directly responsible for their choices in worship. Again, I told you, the problem is not that Baal exists in the secular world. The problem is that they chose him over Yahweh. God makes it very clear his judgment is against his people, and he reaffirms his sovereignty as God. All right, verses 8 through 10. But I will spare some, for some of you will escape the sword when you are scattered among the lands and the nations. The ones that are spared are the remnant. The ones that stayed to fight are going to be killed, and they're not the remnant. They thought they were. Then verse 9 says, then the nations where they have been carried captive, those who escape will remember me, how I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes, which have lusted after their idols. They will loathe themselves. When this all comes to pass, this is very interesting. They're going to hate themselves. They're going to realize what they've done, and they're going to hate themselves because of it. They will loathe themselves for the evil they have done and for all their detestable practices. That term detestable practices is used throughout the NIV. So you need to get used to hearing it. You're starting to hear it a little bit now. It's going to be more and more as we go along. And they will know that I am the Lord. I did not threaten in vain to bring this calamity on them. This is the third of 4 divisions of the chapter. It sounds very hopeless for the captives to this point, but here God gives a word of encouragement and one of hope. And that word of encouragement is there's going to be a remnant. All of y'all aren't going to be killed. It's great for the ones that are going to be killed. Yeah, well, great. I'm glad some of us are going to survive, but too bad for me. Not everyone will die. And you have to realize that from God's perspective, he is showing mercy. And we should come to realize that as well. The Israelites, the Jews today should look back on this and know there is a remnant. They do know there is a remnant. They're the most persecuted people of all times, and yet they're still huge in numbers throughout the world. God has always shown mercy on them. This is before 587 BC, when Jerusalem and the temple have not yet been destroyed. So this is prophecy. These things haven't happened yet. We don't know how bad, they do not know how bad it's going to be. But remember, they don't like Ezekiel's message because the false prophet are telling them the stuff of the 4 false assumptions. I wonder if I can remember what they were. I'll tell you, see if I can remember. I used to have them written on the board, but we don't have a board anymore. One was the day of the Lord, Jerusalem will never be destroyed. This is what they're being told and what they have bought into, because it beats the alternative, the other side of the message, which is what Ezekiel is telling them, that Jerusalem is where God put his name. It's his city. It's where his temple is. It's where he lives. It will never be destroyed. They believe that they have done everything they needed to do out of ritualistic sacrifices and offerings required by the law. The fact that their hearts were not anywhere close to loving God is beside the point in their mind. God, that's the part God doesn't like. And the day of the Lord means victory for God, but it also means victory for Israel. They're going to find out that is not true. The day of the Lord is the day of the Lord. Israel is going to be defeated and they're going into exile. Okay, verse 9, in captivity they will remember God and the stuff he does not like and will not accept. He says they have adulterous hearts. They're grieved. They're grieved by, he is grieved by their adulterous hearts. They've turned away from him. Their eyes have lusted after idols. In this remembrance, they will hate themselves for the evil they have done and for the detestable practices. One of the purposes, aside from discipline of his people, was to remove all future worship practices that involved something other than worship of Yahweh. And in terms of secular, literal idols, he has done exactly that. They don't worship detestable, secular idols anymore to this day. He was successful in ridding the land of that. Okay, so before we look at verse 9 and 10, he uses the term grieved by. In verse 8 he says, how I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts. Grieved by. You remember what he said before the flood when he looked at the violence and the sinful hearts of man? He said, I'm grieved that I ever made them. His heart is grieved to the point where he cannot stand it anymore. He has to bring judgment upon them. Just like the flood was judgment for them, he promised he would never destroy man by a flood again. But nevertheless, they have come to the point that they're at now, and he is grieved to the point of having to deal with his righteous judgment, and they're going to face judgment as a result of it. Okay, verse 10. Let me read verse 10. And they will know that I am the Lord. I did not threaten in vain to bring this calamity on them. In vain. What an interesting word. The big warning came in Leviticus 26. We talked about that last week or the week before, where he warned them back in the days of Moses what would happen if they did the things that they're doing today. I mean, in the days of Ezekiel, what would happen? He warned them. Now that those things are starting to happen, what does God do when he says, I'm going to do certain things to you? Does he have to do it or not? He's a God of his word, and he will do it. So he said there in verse 10, I did not threaten in vain. My threats are not empty. Go back to read Leviticus 26. My threats are not empty. I mean what I say. You can count on what I say because I am the God of truth. I want you to think about that. I went to great lengths. In my book, What God Did, to talk about God as the God of truth. I want to read something to you from page, I believe it was actually from 39. What I said about the God of truth. Now, this is along the lines of, I did not threaten in vain. If he says he makes these threats and then he doesn't follow through, his threats were in vain. And that would mean you can't count on what he says. But he says you can count on what I'm saying because I did not threaten in vain. What I said here was that I believe truth is, we're talking about the God of truth here on page 38 and 39. I devoted 2 whole pages to this. But I believe truth is the perfect foundation for creation. That is, the foundation on which everything is created. He, according to Proverbs 8, 22 and 23, he used wisdom as he created. But the foundation on which he created everything is truth. Truth is embedded in creation with the other attributes of God, but with the exception of holiness, truth seems to stand out as the one attribute that it encompasses all of the others. Now listen to this. For God is nothing if not truthful. His righteousness stands out in relation to his truthfulness. His faithfulness can be counted on because of his faithfulness. Let me just say something about that while I'm still reading here. His faithfulness can be counted on because of his truthfulness. We don't know he's faithful because we don't know he's always going to be faithful because he has been faithful. We know he's always going to be faithful because he is the God of truth. What he says is true. And when he says, I'm faithful, that means you can count on his faithfulness. He's been faithful to now. And because he's the God of truth, we know he does not lie. We know he's going to be faithful in the future. His faithfulness can be counted on because of his truthfulness. His capacity to love transcends eternity because of his truthfulness. We know he loves us and that he will always loves us because of his truthfulness. And yes, about his goodness, how good could he be without truthfulness? He is the God of truth. What he says you can count on, and he does not threaten in vain, according to verse 10. Oh, yes. There's something else. I asked my class one time what the opposite of love is. What would you think the opposite of love is? Just think about that a minute. Hate? You think it's hate? Well, I want to share something with you from this book, Testaments of Love. It's by Leon Morris. When I bought this book, Testaments of Love, a study of love in the Bible. It's very interesting. It's a pretty thick book. It's pretty exhaustive, really. But I asked my class, what do you think the opposite of love is? And it's all the universal answer is going to be hate, unless you read this book. The opposite of love, from God's perspective, from his love, is wrath. Now we're talking about wrath in Ezekiel, wrath in the end times, wrath in his final judgment of people that do not accept Christ. The Christians are protected from his wrath because of our faithfulness to Christ. Here, his wrath is going to be delivered to the people. But let me read this to you. He says, I don't know how much of this I want to read. But God's wrath is real, and it is taken seriously throughout the Old Testament. Well, you got to know that's for sure when you're reading Ezekiel. But his love is also real, and it receives the emphasis. The wrath is but the other side of his love. Wrath is the other side of his love. It's the opposite of his love. Love is here. If you look at it as a sphere, you got love on this side. The exact opposite, all the way to the other side, is wrath. Now, what I want to point out to you, for the people of this day, of Ezekiel's day, and for today as well, they want to believe the good part. God is love, and he doesn't want to punish. In fact, he won't punish because he is a God of love. But the point is, there's two sides to God. What this footnote says from C.N. Schofield is that there is nothing capricious about his destructive wrath. It is so terrible because it is the other side of love, and it is as great as his love. It is as great as his love. So if you think that God is nothing but love and he will not punish, think again. When he comes to the point of punishing and delivering his wrath, it's going to be as strong as you feel that his love is. He will punish, and when he directs his discipline to his people, he directs it with wrath, the opposite of love. I just had to share that with you because we need to get to, we're early in our study here of Ezekiel. We need to get perspective on what kind of feeling God has as he goes through this discipline of his people. He is fed up with their apostasy, and he's delivering his discipline in wrath. Okay, verse 11. 11 through 14 is the fourth division of the chapter. Let me read verse 11. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Strike your hands together and stamp your feet and cry out, alas, because of all the wicked and detestable practices. He's telling Ezekiel to do this. Clap your hands, stamp your feet. He's saying, act that out, stamp it, do that, and cry out, alas, because of all the wickedness, the wicked and detestable practices of the people of Israel. They will fall by the sword, famine, and plague. Fall by the sword, famine, and plague. Strike your hands, stamp your feet, cry out, alas, expressions of unhappiness, pity, and concern. Expressions to decry the abominations and idolatrous practices of the people. What they will get is death. What they get, according to that, is death, famine, and plague. Verse 12. One who is far away will die of the plague, and one who is near will fall by the sword, and anyone who strives and is spared will die of famine. These are the ones that stay behind. These are not the ones taken into exile. So will I pour out my wrath on them. So that's the way they're going to die. Verse verse 13, and they will know that I am the Lord. See, you keep seeing that term. They're going to know it's God that's doing it. And they will know that I am the Lord when their people lie slain among their idols, around their altars, on every high hill, and on all the mountaintops, under every spreading tree and every leafy oak, places where they offered fragrant incense to all their idols. Those are their worship places in the high places. All those things that he just mentioned, they're going to find dead people. Then in verse 14, it's all centered around adultery. Verse 14 says, and I will stretch out my hand against them, and I will make the land a desolate waste from the desert to Diblah, where they live, wherever they live. Then they will know that I am the Lord. So Diblah may be a reference to Riblah, which is a place where Zedekiah, who was a vassal king, was captured. A vassal king from, can't remember I think it was probably Assyria, where they captured their a king that they had set up who rebelled against Assyria. They captured him and his sons, and they killed all of his, while they held Zedekiah there to watch, they killed all of his sons, and then they put his eyes out and blinded him and didn't kill him. So that was the last thing he saw, and the last thing he would remember was the death of his children. Okay, so that's what this says. I will stretch out my hand against them and make the land a desolate waste from the desert to Diblah, where that actually happened. Wherever they live, they will know that I am the Lord. So they're going to know, because of the way it happens, that it's God that did it. The point is that the people, and even today, even particularly today, the people know him either in their response to his loving attempts of salvation and fellowship, or through judgment. That gets back to those two sides of God. He loves. We think he loves and will not punish. But on the other hand, we want to believe that part. But the other side, the direct opposite of that, is wrath. And that is his judgment, which he will deliver to those that do not love him. Okay, chapter 7. See if we can run through this. It's a long chapter. We're not going to deal with it word for word. But chapter 7 carries the same message of chapters 4 through 6, the scattering, the death by sword, famine, and plague, and destruction. Now, this is a summary message with 6 parts. 1 through 4 is an announcement of God's intention to bring judgment. And there's no question by the time we finish Ezekiel that he's talking judgment. Verses 5 through 9 is a repeated call for judgment to come. Verses 10 through 13 are the imminence and certainty of judgment, the announcement of that. Verse 14 through 18 is total destruction of the nations is announced. Verse 19 through 22 is the uselessness of all physical resources. You're going to see gold and silver scattered in the streets. And then verse 23 through 27 is the announcement of the coming fall of Jerusalem. Okay, Hebrews 11:16 says, without faith is it impossible to please God. So that's New Testament, but it's always looking back to the Old Testament. We have the New Testament because of the Old Testament. And to understand the Old Testament, he says that without faith it is impossible to please God. These people have no faith in God. What they have is faith in idols. It's hard to understand that, but that's the way it is. It's because of their lack of understanding of any God. Their lack of understanding of any God. Let me read verse 7, verses 1 through 4. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says to the land of Israel. The end has come upon the 4 corners of the land. The end is now upon you, and I will unleash my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for what all of repay you for all of your detestable practices. I will not look on you with pity. I will not spare you. I will surely repay you for your conduct and for the detestable practices among you. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Get used to hearing that. The message is to the land of Israel, the four corners of the land. That's the whole of Israel. This message is literally, an end has come, the end is now upon you. That's a pretty dire warning or announcement. The end is a horrible way to think about judgment, as the end. As with many prophecies, it is spoken of as if it has already occurred. It's talking about in past tense, but it means that it's absolute certainty. Prophecy is many times spoken of in such a thing as if it's already occurred, so it uses past tense. It's looking forward to an event that is going to happen with certainty. It will be complete. It covers the four corners. No city will be spared. So what does that say about Jerusalem, the protected city? That's one of those four false assumptions that they labor under from the false teachers. It's where the temple is. It's where God lives. It's the city he put his name on. It's protected. That's a false assumption. They're going to see that that's going to be destroyed with certainty. Verse 3, let me read that again. The end is now upon you, and I will unleash my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. There are no signs of true repentance, so your judgment will be based on your what? On your conduct and your detestable practices. If you are repentant, then I could throw repentant into the loop, but there is none. So what you get is based on your conduct and detestable practices. Verse 4 says, no pity. I will only repay, which is an interesting word. Repayment means pay back for what I got from you. It should be clear God takes their actions personally. He does not deliver judgment for the fun of it. His goal is redemption, which means his discipline is meted out under the hope that he will draw his people back to them. He is a God of mercy, but he is also a God of justice. It sounds like a dilemma. He's got mercy, love and mercy on one side. I want to show that, but I also am a just God. How do I handle both of those things and still be true to myself? He acted against Judah in anger to produce a repentant heart, and he opens the door for more mercy and grace. But even while acting in righteous anger, he showed mercy for some. A remnant will be spared. All right, verses 5 through 9. It's the second division of this chapter. We get it all here. We're going to see disaster, doom, the end, and repay, all in the same few verses. Let me read verses 5 through 7 of chapter 7. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Disaster, unheard of disaster. See, it comes. The end has come. The end has come. It has aroused itself against you. See, it comes. Doom has come upon you who dwell in the land. The time has come. The day is near. There is panic, not joy, on the mountains. Panic, not joy. Joy is dead. Disaster, unheard of disaster. It is unprecedented. It has never happened before. It is coming. You can't get ready for it. It's too late to get ready for it. It's upon you. The end has come. I am against you. Doom is upon those who dwell in the land. Who is this? Who is this? It's everybody. It's all of the Israelites. That's who dwells in the land. Doom is the word with an uncertain meaning, although we think we know how to use it. The root probably has a meaning coming from to twist, suggesting something like something comes around in a full circle. What goes around comes around. For sure, it results in a loss of joy on the mountains, where the high places were used for fertility rites, and the harvest celebration of joy took place, as we saw in chapter 6. The harvest celebration of joy. Now, I want to tell you, in our study of Hosea, which was a parallel to this study in Ezekiel, Ezekiel's for the southern kingdom, Hosea was for the northern kingdom. I produced a video called The Death of Joy. It's in our playlist on Hosea. It's chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. They had lost all reason for joy in the fertility rites and the of their humanity, and also of their crops. The joy was replaced with panic and fear. They had they had been ravaged by Assyria, the northern kingdom had, and they will have no reason to rejoice. And that's the crux of those verses. No reason to rejoice. This is going to be the same way for Babylon, for Israel, as they deal with the oncoming Babylonian army. Let me read verses 8 and 9. I'm about to pour out my wrath on you and spend my anger. Yeah, that's what it said at the end of verse 7. There is panic, not joy. There is no joy in Jerusalem. I'm about to pour out my wrath on you and spend my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. In verse 9, I will not look on you with pity. I will not spare you. I will repay you for your conduct and for the detestable practices among you. Then you will know that it is I, the Lord, who strikes you. Do you see why they would rather believe the false prophets? False prophets was a positive message. The Babylonians' army standing right outside the gates. They're not coming in here. This is God's city. Ezekiel's giving them a total message. They're standing outside the gates because they're getting ready to conquer you. They don't want to believe that message. They just ignore it. Again, anger and wrath and judgment. It's mentioned in connection with their conduct and their detestable practices. In this chapter alone, God has repeated himself 3 times, meaning listen up, but they do not listen up. He repeats himself for emphasis. If I tell you 3 times, I want you to know what I'm saying and understand it. He tells them 3 times what's getting ready to happen. He said, it seems clear that the hardened hearts and disbelief caused by the false prophets provide for no positive response. In fact, they cause a negative response of disbelief. They hear the positive message from the false prophets, and that message causes the disbelief. Of course, they're adults. They're supposed to have their head and use their brains, but they reject the message of Ezekiel to accept the positive side that's coming from the false prophet. Judgment can be renewed. Judgment can bring renewed interest in spiritual things, but sometimes it brings only anger and blame without any willingness to take responsibility for their actions. But regardless of how you judge yourself, guilt is there nonetheless. They think they're okay. One of the false assumptions they were laboring under was that we've kept the law, we have made our offerings, we've provided our sacrifices. That's all we need to do. I'm a pretty good Jew. I've done all that God expects of me. But the point of the matter is, that's not all he expects of you. He expects love and faith, which they delivered none of that. So the judgment of themselves, saying, I'm a pretty good person, stands today as we put ourselves up against the need for Jesus Christ. We say, well, I don't really need Jesus. I'm a pretty good person. God's not going to judge me. Well, like these Israelites, we're going to find out that's not true. If you don't have faith in Jesus Christ, you're going to find out you're in as bad a shape, or worse shape actually, than what these Hebrew people are in, because of the way they were treating God. Many times God uses tragedy to draw people to himself. So that's his hope, is that he can draw his people back. And he will. Someday. All right, verses 10 through 13. Hope it keeps that from cutting off. I had it cut off right in the middle of my lesson sometimes. All right, verse 10 says this, chapter 7, verse 10. See the day, see it comes, doom has burst forth, the rod has budded, arrogance has blossomed. Judgment is imminent. See the day, see it comes. And in support of that, he says that judgment is imminent, fixed, and irreversible. It is too late. Even if you change your ways, express faith in me, it's too late to avert disaster. We need to know that. There are consequences that we have to live with for our sin. And sometimes God lets us live with the consequences. These are the consequences of their sin. They're going into exile. We know God will use Babylon to be the rod to judge Israel. Here it talks about them as being doom has burst forth, verse 10. The rod has budded, arrogance has blossomed. All of that indicates where you might say those are terms showing new life and growth. What that is the budding of God's wrath. Remember, the interesting one there for me is the rod has budded. If you remember back to the Exodus, God gives the law to Moses, and they get to a point where they need to choose the first high priest. And Moses said, what you need to do, all the candidates to be high priest, take your staff, which is an old dead piece of wood that they used to walk around with, throw it over there in a corner, and whichever one buds, which means starts sprouting green leaves, is going to be the high priest. Well, as it turns out, it was Aaron. But it's the most unlikely thing. Take an old dead piece of wood, and if it sprouts, you're the man. Well, this sprouting is talking, the rod has budded. The rod of discipline is Babylon, and it has budded. It has come to fruition. It is time for God's wrath to be meted out to them. And verse 11 says, violence has arisen, a rod to punish the wicked. Violence has arisen, a rod to punish the wicked. None of the people will be left, none of that crowd, none of the wealth, none of the value. Wow. No wealth, all of the elements which provide stability to life will be wiped out. That's what's going to happen. Their life their peaceful, wealthful, comfortable lives are changing. Verses 12 through 13 make it pretty clear. Let's read verse 12 and 13. The time has come. Whoa. The time has come. The day has arrived. Let not the buyer rejoice, nor let not the buyer rejoice, nor the seller grieve, for my wrath is on the whole crowd. In verse 13, the seller will not recover the property that was sold as long as both buyer and seller live, for the vision concerning the whole crowd will not be reversed. Because of their sins, not one of them will preserve their life. Wow, that pretty much says it all. Buyers, for example, will not be happy with the great deal they got. You know, you got still, the city hadn't fallen yet. You got the buyers and the sellers, you know, and the sellers are cutting prices, and the buyers are not happy with the price they got, even though it's such a great deal. The sellers will not have seller's remorse. You know, I had a friend that had a lot of classic cars, and he loved those old cars. They were some of them were restored and in better shape than others. But whenever he would sell one, he would start feeling real bad. It was almost like his children. He loved those cars so much. And whenever he would sell one, he would have what I call buyer's remorse. I wish I could have it back. Well, the thing, or I wish I hadn't sold it. That's not the way it's going to be with the sellers in Jerusalem. When they sell something, they're going to be glad it's gone, and there's not any way they're going to want it back. All right, so we go to the fourth division of the chapters, verses 14 to 18. Let me read verse 14. They have blown the trumpet, they have made all things ready, but no one will go into battle, for my wrath is on the whole crowd. To understand the nuances of every line of these prophecies would be to strike terror in their hearts if they really understood what Ezekiel was telling them. Total destruction of the nation is coming. The first element would be to sound the alarm at the invading army, but there will be no sound because of paralysis and terror. Verse 15. Outside, he said there in 14, but there will be no one to go. He said in 14, they have blown the trumpet, they have made all things ready, but because of the fear, and they're going to be paralyzed because of fear. Then verse 15 says, outside is the sword, inside is plague and famine. Outside is the Babylonian army. You go out there to fight, you're going to be slaughtered with the sword. Jerusalem will be surrounded. So inside, they're going to be starved out. They're going to be dealing with plague and famine. So that's the three ways to die. Those in the country will die by the sword. Those in the city will be devoured by famine and plague. In verse 16, the fugitives who escape will flee to the mountains. Like doves of the valleys, they will all moan, each for their own sins. I just want to make a side comment here because I just now thought of this or remembered this. One of the things that happened when people would try to escape from Jerusalem. Remember Jacob and Esau? Jacob became the father of Israel, and Esau became the father of Edom, the Edomites, and they hated each other. The Edomites hated the Jews, the Israelites. And whenever some of these Israelites would try to escape, this went on for a long time, from the days of Jacob and Esau. So whenever some of these Israelites would try to escape, maybe sneak out in the dark of night or whatever, try to escape from Jerusalem, sometimes the Edomites were out hiding on the roads to catch them and take them prisoner and give them to Babylon. It's terrible. That's what the whole book of Obadiah is. We got a video on that. We studied that after we studied Hosea, and it might be fun to use the term loosely, to read through that or study through it. That video, it was covered the whole book in one day, and that might have had to do with people escaping in the northern kingdom in the days of the Assyrians. But I think it was the days of the southern kingdom that we're talking about now. Nevertheless, they go to remote hiding places to escape the invading army. In verse 17, every hand will go limp, every leg will be wet with urine. Now that's fear. That is fear when you urinate on yourself. Verse 18, they will put on sackcloth and be clothed with terror. Every face will be covered with shame and every head will be shaved. The sackcloth is usually used for mourning, and repentance will be used to indicate the reality of catastrophe. They'll mourn before it actually happens, is what that's saying, but they're going to know it's happening. They were not sorry for their sin. They were sorry for having to cope with discomfort and horror. Remember, I told you when we first started this, the days of the northern kingdom and the days of the southern kingdom were times of unparalleled prosperity. They were wealthy beyond our imagination, most likely, and they're sorry that life is gone. They don't want to repent for their sin. They just want to be sorry for having to lose all that and live the kind of life that's coming on them. Okay, verse 19 to 22 is the fifth division of the chapter. Let me read verse 19. They will throw their silver. Here's what I was talking about at the very beginning of the lesson. They will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be treated as a thing unclean. Their silver and gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. It will not satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs, for it has caused them to stumble into sin. Wow. All pretty clear. The invading armies made their wealth useless. Piles of gold. I got piles of gold. Guess what? My city's surrounded. I can't use it. The interesting part of this verse is that it made them stumble into sin. Materialism, that is, caused them to stumble into sin. You get too much money, you become self-sufficient, and you don't need God. I mean, not everybody, but I mean, that can be a tendency. I don't need God. I'm wealthy. I make my own luck. I got my own stuff. If I need something, I'll go buy it. Over the decades, they become self-sufficient, not needing God. And I'm saying that as a nation, the United States of America should be very careful. Very wealthy nation we are. Even in recession, we're better off than most. And we need to be careful. We need to not get to the point, we may already be at that point where we're self-sufficient and don't need God. All right, let's look at verse 20. They took pride in their beautiful jewelry and used it to make their detestable idols. Melt down the gold of my jewelry, make me an idol. They made it into vile images. Therefore, I will make it a thing unclean for them. It goes beyond being a sinful thing. It becomes an unclean thing. You know, the Jewish law provided certain things to be clean and unclean. He's saying here, what God is going to do is make that gold that you've got and all that jewelry as a thing that is unclean. It led from the spiritual standpoint. It will be regarded as something unclean, which can contaminate everyone and everything it touches. It led them into sin by providing the gold they used to make their idols, the materials for the people's idolatry. Their gold was melted down and silver was melted down and made idols out of. Our verses 21 to 22, we're going to race through these last few verses. Verse 21 to 22 has to do with desecration of the temple artifacts and looting of the temple. Let me read 21 to 22. I will give their wealth as plunder to the foreigners and as loot to the wicked of the earth who will defile it. I will turn my face away from the people, and robbers will desecrate the place I treasure. Robbers will desecrate the place I treasure. They will enter it and will defile it. They will enter the temple and defile it, is what that's talking about. Nebuchadnezzar took the golden implements and artifacts from the temple. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. When Jerusalem fell, he took the temple, he took the golden implements and artifacts from the temple and profaned them in the temple of his pagan gods. He didn't destroy them. He didn't melt them down. He took them and used them. He moved them from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem to his pagan temples in Babylon and used them there. So in that sense, he defiled the temple artifacts. Verse 22 seems to anticipate the departure of God's glory from the temple. This will be formally discussed and studied in chapter 10. That is a very sad chapter. Chapter 8 and chapter 10 are very sad chapters to me, but chapter 10 is where God's glory vacated the temple. But this prophecy indicates desecration of the temple, one of the four false prophecies of protection of the temple. So it's supposed to be, from their perspective and their understanding what the top false teachers say, Jerusalem and the temple are protected. But the prophecy here is the temple is going to be defiled. It says that in 22, I will turn my face away from the people, and robbers will desecrate the place I treasure, which is the temple. They will enter it and they will defile it. All right, verse 23 to 27 is the last few verses of the chapter. It's the sixth division of the chapter. Let me read verse 23. Prepare chains, for the land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of violence. There is a violent overthrow of the city with the inhabitants taken captive. I mean, they're going to have siege ramps and the whole thing. They're going to knock down the gates. They're going to burn everything. It's going to be a violent overthrow. The kind of change Ezekiel mentions in this prophecy is the type used as a fetter for captors going to Babylon. Prepare the chains. Prepare the fetter. We're going to take these people captive, and when we take them to Babylon, they're going to be in chains. Get those chains ready. So prepare the chains. In verse 24 to 27, let me read through it. It just takes a minute. 24 to 27, just so we can say we looked at the whole chapter. I will bring the most wicked of nations to take possession of their houses. That means Babylon is going to take the houses of the Jews. I will put an end to the pride of the mighty, and their sanctuaries will be desecrated. The pride, the people with the pride are the Jews. He's taken that from them, going to desecrate the temple. 25, when terror comes, they will seek peace in vain. There will be no peace. Calamity upon calamity will come, and rumor upon rumor. They will go searching. Listen to this. They will go searching for a vision from the prophet. Priestly instruction in the law will cease. The counsel of the elders will come to an end. And then verse 27, the king will mourn, the prince will be clothed with despair, and the hands of the people of the land will tremble. I will deal with them according to their conduct and by their own standards I will judge them. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Okay, I already said in verse 23, there's a violent overthrow of the city and the inhabitants taken captive. The kind of chains they used for taking prisoners and marching them long distances, the kind of chains that they're talking to in 23. In 24, instead of peace, prosperity, and solidarity as a nation, they're going to find exile brought pain and loss and confusion. Then in 26, it says there will be no prophet, no priest, and no elder to give them instruction. There will be no place to go to find spiritual leadership. They hadn't wanted it before. They didn't want to talk to God before. They don't need to. They fulfilled their requirements by taking their offerings and sacrifices according to law to the temple. They didn't need to give love and faith to God. Now there's no place to find somebody that can talk to God for them. Verse 27, there will be no king or prince as they have always wanted. Give us a king like the other nations have. Remember going back to when they got King Saul as their first king. I, God, will deal with them according to their conduct and their standards. I will judge you by the standards you set for your life. But I judge it by the standards you set up against the standards that I set. And you're going to be found wanting on the day of judgment. Wow, I guess that's all I have for you today. I think this is going to be a wonderful study. We're starting to get pretty far into the book now. We've got 7 chapters behind us. So we'll keep going next week. And I want to thank you for being with me today. That's all I have for you. Thank you.